With today's landscape of superhero movie after superhero movie, I think it's very easy to forget where all of this started. Sure, you could say the MCU started with Iron Man, the critical acclaim started with The Dark Knight, and if we go back even further, nope, not quite that far, sometime after that, there we go, then we find a little known franchise called X-Men. I'm not sure if I've said this on my channel or not, but the X-Men have always been the top tier group of superheroes for me. Sure, the Avengers are cool, the Justice League, nope, not you, is really great, but nothing has ever really come close to the X-Men for me. I grew up watching some of the 90s cartoons, but I really fell in love with the group due to X-Men Evolution. So ever since, I've always looked forward to the live-action X-Men films. They're not without their problems, that's for sure, but I always saw each new installment and looked forward to the next one. Unluckily for myself, I feel like I'm in the minority for people who love these films. There's obviously some better ones and some ones that I try to forget entirely, but what really put people off of these movies is the timeline. Where does this movie take place? How does this make any sense? And while I follow the timelines pretty religiously, I can see where people started to get lost. So in today's video, I'm going to be trying to make sense of this messy timeline, giving you all the information you need to know on each film and a brief review before going into the kinda, not really chronological timeline of it all. But it'll all be explained. If you want to check out that portion for yourself, I'll leave the time card on screen now, but you might be a little bit confused. So let's head on over to Xavier's Academy for gifted individuals, put on the Cerebro helmet, and go through the entire timeline of the X-Men franchise. We start off with the film where it all began, the 2000 film X-Men. X-Men shows us a world where humans and mutants, the people with superpowers, coexist, though mutants are often discriminated against due to their weirdness. This pits Charles Xavier, the head of Xavier's Institute, against Eric Lencher's Brotherhood. Charles, or Professor X, wants his students to learn to control their powers for good, while Eric, or Magneto, believes that mutants are the more evolved species, and therefore should rule the world. We follow the journey of Rogue, who, after almost killing her boyfriend by kissing him, runs away from home, meets a grizzled mentor who helps her on her journey, where she ends up at the school. This all sounds so familiar, but this movie does something strange in switching protagonists about 20 minutes into the movie. Wolverine becomes our main character for the remainder of this movie, and just about every movie in the franchise. He goes on to reluctantly join the X-Men, a group of leather-wearing people with superhuman abilities. There's plenty of mystery surrounding Wolverine and his backstory, and this is told pretty well, leaving the mystery open for sequels while still focusing on telling the story at hand. The group thinks that Magneto wants Wolverine for some reason, so they keep him at the Institute to try and figure out why, but in reality he wants Rogue and her powers in order to power up his machine that would make all of the world leaders into mutants. Rogue takes off yet again and Magneto captures her, so it's up to the X-Men to come and save her and foil Magneto's plans. Now, if you judge this movie by today's comic book movie standards, it's a little too serious for its own good. It's a little bit cheesy, and not even with the visual effects, which have aged pretty good if I'm being honest, and if you compare this to the X-Men of the comics or the cartoon, then you might not like this movie at all. Wolverine as the lead of the movie, with Cyclops having a significantly reduced role, the Wolverine and Jean Grey romance, some of the characterizations, and especially the costumes, leave a lot to be desired.
What would you prefer? Yellow spandex?
But judging this movie by the standard of the year 2000, this movie is pretty incredible. To have such a huge cast of characters, each of them with their own unique superpower, tell a story grounded in reality and not make it laughably bad, was a pretty tall order. And when you look at it that way, this movie achieved greatness. Without X-Men, there is no MCU, there is no DCEU, okay, maybe that one wasn't for the better, but X-Men really was the blueprint for team-up superhero movies. When the first Avengers movie came out, it was definitely groundbreaking, but I remember people saying things like, oh, there's never been more than one superhero in a movie before, and I just pointed at the X-Men movies because there were already several of them at that point. One of the main reasons that this movie still holds up so well is the cast. You have Patrick Stewart and Ian McKellen in roles that seemed impossible to recast, Hugh Jackman as Wolverine, which is clearly an impossible role to recast, and all of these supporting actors do fantastic in their own respective roles that have been beloved by comic book fans for decades. Some of the younger kids' acting is not the greatest, but that's to be expected in terms of things like this, and the bigger actors definitely balance it out quite nicely. Patrick Stewart and Ian McKellen, of course, steal the show. They do such a phenomenal job at balancing each other out, with Magneto being a better villain than 95% of all other comic book movie villains. Give me Magneto over literally any villain we've seen in the MCU, and that's not an exaggeration. He has such a believable motivation that allows you to really sympathize with his cause. This brotherhood that he leads might be a shadow of what the characters they could be, but it's much better than the insert CGI monster from the third act we've seen in just about every other Marvel movie. Speaking of Hugh Jackman, it's crazy how small he was in this movie compared to his Wolverine performances now. Also, it's an extremely popular subgenre today to show grown man taking care of child and father-like role, so popular that this franchise even did it again, but this movie does it very well already with Logan and Rogue. Although at the end, Jean tells him that Rogue has like a crush on him, so that was a little weird, but let's just move past that. Is this movie perfect? Not by any means, but it's still supremely overlooked for what it did for the comic book movie genre. I'd give this movie a solid 8 out of 10. Now, this movie does everything that the first movie did, but on a higher level and executed almost to perfection. It's crazy to think that sequels are usually always worse than the original, and the two superhero movies that paved the way for the MCU both had sequels that are considered to be some of the best comic book movies ever made. The acting is better with the teenage aspects, the characters are done better, and to top it all off, we get one of the best themes in superhero history. Seriously, just listen to this. Some of the scenes and sequences in this movie are some of the most iconic, certainly in this franchise, but also in all of superheroes. The opening White House attack with Nightcrawler, Stryker's mansion attack that I actually wasn't allowed to watch as a kid. My mom would always skip this part because I hero worshipped Wolverine, and this was him at his most unhinged and brutal. Thanks for that, Mom. I know you're watching this. But anyways, this movie just about wholly centers on Wolverine. There's no question who the protagonist is this time around. It's certainly Wolverine, and we get to explore a lot of his backstory that was brought up during the first film. This hyper focus on Wolverine does come with its fair share of troubles as well, both for this movie and the rest of the franchise. Characters that are close to Wolverine get a fair share of screen time, like Jean Grey, since their love triangle with Cyclops is still a primary storyline, which in essence makes Cyclops even less of a character than he was in the last one, and that's saying something. I think the most interesting thing that we learn about Cyclops in this movie is that he's an NSYNC fan.
What are you doing?
This movie shows us a plot that we've seen many times before, and one we'll see again in this franchise, but that's two enemies coming together to face a greater threat. What makes this plot work is the characters. I've mentioned before that Professor X and Magneto have a very interesting dynamic, and that continues to unfold throughout this film. It also helps when their common enemy is one that holds answers to Wolverine's backstory, making all the plot threads come together nicely without any side plots that don't really make a ton of sense. Even the teenagers' plotline ties together throughout the film, and in the end doesn't feel too contrived or forced. This movie once again shows relevance with scenes like Bobby coming out to his parents as a mutant. These kinds of scenes aren't forced or heavy-handed, and I just hope that when the MCU introduces the X-Men, they'll take some pages out of the book of Fox's X-Men when it comes to commentary of social events. Some of this movie has aged quite nicely. The special effects still hold up pretty well, and some of it hasn't, like the insinuated romance between Rogue and Wolverine, including him asking about her sex life.
Boyfriend? So how do you guys...
Well, we're still working on it.
But these moments aside, some of the aspects that I really liked about this movie are the smaller things like the moments at the mansion. They really emphasize that this is a school with teachers and students just trying to learn and live their life. This makes the attack that much more intense, which might also be another thing that hasn't aged that well in today's current climate. But the scene emphasizes Wolverine's character development, forcing him to take care of the kids since all the other mentors are away. This is something that Wolverine probably wouldn't have done in the first movie, and while he might might protect these kids in his own unique way, he's still doing all that he can to protect them. Like I mentioned, the thing that works in this film are the characters, and they add in another powerhouse actor with Brian Cox playing William Stryker, the antagonist for both Charles and Eric, forcing them to come together against the greater enemy. This forces both of them and their respective teams to come together because in the end they both want what's best for mutants, they just don't entirely agree on what's right. But once again, Stryker isn't just a one-dimensional villain who hates mutants, he has a concrete plan and backstory involving his family that makes him just as compelling as a villain as Magneto was in the first film. Not to say that Magneto isn't great in this film either, because while he does some evil things, he still gives you a good reason to side with him. In all honesty, if I was a mutant and I had some cool superpower, I'd probably side with Magneto too. So these two forces work together to stop Stryker and rescue Charles before splitting up once again. All of the side character arcs come together quite nicely. Pyro joins Magneto, Wolverine learns to move on from his past, and Jean's new powers come in use for something in a great and heartbreaking scene to give her life and save the rest of the X-Men. Or so we think. This movie does everything that the first film does, and it does it on a better level. The use of powers are unique and come at the right moments, whether that be for a big scene or just something small that adds to the character. But again, there are certain characters that are sidelined and some issues that remain throughout due to certain characterizations. But it's kind of just the way things are with these movies in general. One of the characters that really shines in this film that didn't do much in the first film was Mystique. They do a really good job of humanizing her and giving her some really interesting scenes, far more than some others. Mystique would go on to be one of the most important characters in the franchise, for better or worse, but I'll get to that later. I also can't talk about this movie without mentioning X-Men: The Official Game, which is largely based on this film, though it tells its own story. It's a game I very much loved playing, and I grew up playing it like all day long. Excellent movie, can't wait for the third installment and the grand finale. I'm sure it's going to be great, but as for this one, I'll give it a solid 9 out of 10. Before we get to the third film, which I'm sure is going to be an absolute blast, I'm going to do that YouTuber thing and say that only about 10% of you are subscribed, so if you're liking what you're seeing so far, you should click that subscribe button. I'd greatly appreciate it. So let's go over some backstory for this film first. The first two movies came out in 2000 and 2002 respectively, but this one came out in 2006, 4 years after the previous film. Why is that? To summarize things, production was absolute hell. Basically, the entire team behind the first two films departed to go and make Superman Returns, leaving a scramble to try and get a new director, to which basically none that were offered the job were available, one of whom was Matthew Vaughn, who would be an important person to the X-Men universe, but not for a few years. So they handed the job to the last person they could find, Brett Ratner.
Brett's here, and he's like, "Oh, I the ship. Whatever. You weren't on the first two. Cocky son of a bitch."
Brett didn't really know a whole lot about X-Men, and neither did his writers, so Fox intervened with mandatory scenes and plot points. The script was split between two different writing teams, and then what they came up with was combined together, so basically everything seems like it's going to work out in the end. Alright, let's watch. In this film, we get to see the X-Men at the height of their powers. The teenagers from before don't act like teenagers, they get their full leather costumes, Logan is a great teacher, Cyclops is the leader of the team, all is great. Oh no, wait, that's just what should have happened. The teenagers don't have any nuance or level of intrigue as they did in the previous two, they're basically ripped right from the CW. Logan seems to have reverted his character development, and Cyclops is the worst we've ever seen him. You know, for the 15 minutes that he's actually in the film before he's killed off screen. Cyclops in this series is probably the worst form of character assassination when it comes to main characters in a superhero movie. Sure, there's been some badly adapted characters and villains, but truly I don't think there's ever been a worse superhero adaptation than Cyclops. It's not even like he's far worse in this one, he was an awful character in the first two movies as well. He's such a flat character, he loves Jean, and other than that, he's just kind of an asshole. We don't ever get to see him interact as a leader to these kids, even around the adults he doesn't have any kind of banter or really anything that sets him apart from anybody else. This is not Cyclops, this is a weird shell of a character that has laser beams coming from his eyes. When they inevitably make the X-Men part of the MCU, I really hope that Cyclops is done much better than this, because even though he gets better in Fox's X-Men universe, it's not really by much. It's also worth mentioning that Mystique does absolutely nothing in this movie. She's on the same level as Cyclops, except in the previous movie, Mystique actually had some interesting character development. Even Xavier dies, and I think that they did these things to some of these major characters to make room for new characters like Kitty Pryde, the Juggernaut, Beast, Archangel, and a few more, but they aren't really given their proper time to shine. They use their powers in some cool action scenes, but nowhere near as unique and interesting as the previous two movies. Rogue, who was once partly a protagonist in this trilogy, is reduced to a bitter girlfriend and doesn't even become an actual X-Man. I feel like they just had no idea how to utilize her power, so instead they forced a love triangle and made her want to get the cure. This movie had no idea how to handle any existing characters, and no idea how to write new ones either. So this movie has two plot lines, and they don't really mix well together at all. There's this cure for mutants that they have to decide whether is ethical for mutants or not, and then there's the Dark Phoenix plotline where Jean is back and the X-Men have to take care of her. What do these plot lines have to do with one another? Basically nothing at all. I think it's supposed to show that some mutants are so powerful that they should take this cure, but that message doesn't really seem that great when you compare it to the first two. The first two films were about misunderstood people and how we, as a society, shouldn't be afraid of them. But the message of this film is, weird people that we don't understand, we need to get rid of them. This film does still unintentionally have a lot of modern symbolism, with some people being all for this cure and some people saying no way in hell. But other than that, the message is really conflicted and kinda tone deaf of what the first two were trying to say. I will say that Famke Janssen's portrayal of Jean in this movie is pretty great. They might have not written this storyline very well at all, but her performance is fantastic. You can see the moments that the real Jean that we saw in the previous two movies comes through, and then the moments that it's the Phoenix. The distinction in her performance is really great, and honestly one of the highlights of this movie. Magneto isn't even that great in this movie. He's more of your classic movie villain than one that you can sympathize with and see his point of view. He has a few great moments talking about Charles' death, and he still found him a friend and respected him, even trying to stop Jean from killing him, but that's about it. Logan being the one to take out Jean is emotional, kinda. I never really felt their chemistry or romance at all. Logan had like a crush on her in the first two movies, but it was never like she was trying to decide between Scott or Logan. It was always that she was with Scott, and Wolverine was just the bad boy who gave her attention. He tells her he loves her before killing her, and I just didn't really get that at all. This isn't really a this movie issue, more of a problem with the trilogy in general. Some of the action scenes are cool, the final battle feels very much like a typical X-Men battle you'd see from the comics or cartoons. The pacing is pretty good, even if the story we're seeing isn't, and the final scene of the movie with Magneto having a hint of his powers coming back is a truly fantastic scene to end on. This is a fun summer blockbuster, but it's nowhere near on the level of the first two. The script isn't as smart, the nuances of the better characterizations are missing, and the CGI is actually far worse in this one than it was in the previous two. There's a lot more fight scenes and grand events that utilize CGI, and in this one it's pretty noticeable how old this film is. In the end, maybe the real X-Men The Last Stand are the X-Friends that we met along the way. Weird movie plagued by production issues, but still fun in a few moments. 6 out of 10. So this movie sounds pretty good on paper, right? We got a few answers during the trilogy, but a lot of Logan's backstory is still largely unknown. In X-Men 2, Stryker gives some vague exposition about the work they did together, and it sounded pretty cool. Watching a movie giving us all those answers should be really intriguing, right? Unfortunately not. This movie reduces Wolverine to the lowest common denominator. The CGI is worse than it was even back in the first X-Men. It raises a lot more questions than answers when it comes to continuity. It butchers characters to the point that even Fox was poking fun at it in the future, and I don't really want to waste any more of my time or your time talking about this movie. The best thing about this movie has nothing to do with the movie itself, and that's the movie tie-in game. When a movie tie-in game, which are usually awful, is the best thing about your movie, you know you've gone wrong somewhere along the way. Very bad, 3 out of 10. So there's been two not so great movies in a row. We really need a good one here if this franchise has any kind of hope whatsoever. What's that? It's a prequel? Oh, I'm not a very big fan of prequels. They're recasting Professor X and Magneto. This is not sounding good at all. Kevin Bacon is the bad guy? None of this sounds right. This is bound to be a disaster. I didn't actually have these opinions when the movie was first coming out back in 2011. I was still all for more X-Men at that time, but if this movie was coming out now, I'd probably have all of these opinions. I've made it pretty clear that I'm not a fan of prequels on this channel, and my love for Patrick Stewart and Ian McKellen knows no bounds, so recasting them is just mind-blowing to me, but none of these worries are actually even remotely warranted for this film. In First Class, we get to see the background and history of Eric Lenscher and Charles Xavier. We were told that they were once really great friends and they initially opened the school together, but we didn't see how they fell apart. We didn't see them recruit the first mutants to the school, why Charles is in a wheelchair, or anything of that sort, so this movie answers all of those questions to an incredibly satisfying conclusion. First off, James McAvoy and Michael Fassbender are magnificent as Charles and Eric. It seemed like such an impossible task to recast these two characters, but they absolutely kill it in these roles. You can see hints of both Patrick Stewart and Ian McKellen in their performances, and their chemistry as friends works just as well as the older actors does. This movie is directed by Matthew Vaughn, one of the guys who was in the running to make X-Men The Last Stand. Unfortunately, he had to back out of that movie, but if it meant that he had to back out of that film in order to make this one, then I'm completely fine with that. First Class takes what worked in the first two films of this franchise, dials it to 10, adds in some new and unique elements with a fresh voice as director, and delivers either the best or second best X-Men movie that had been made up to this point. Seeing Charles and Eric hone their skills while recruiting mutants, acting like they're young men going to bars and having fun and starting the X-Men was an absolute joy to see on screen. You also start to see their differences pretty early on in the film until that hits a peak during the film's climax. We get all of the answers to our questions. How did they split up? How did Charles end up in a wheelchair? How did the Academy actually start? And there's really no stone left unturned. But wait a minute, some of this stuff doesn't actually line up. Magneto gets his helmet that blocks out Charles' thoughts. He learns about it, but years later in the first X-Men movie, Charles doesn't know why he can't read Eric's thoughts anymore. In the beginning of X-Men The Last Stand, Charles and Eric look like this while going to recruit Jean, but they're split up by the end of this movie, and Jean isn't even in this one. The cracks were definitely starting to form, but I suppose I can see past these ones, even if they don't really make a ton of sense. They work in the context of this movie. Speaking of things that work in the context of this movie, but not in others, let's talk Mystique. One of the stranger things we learn from this film is how good of friends Charles and Raven were since the beginning. There's no mention of this during the trilogy. I'm not sure if they ever even share any lines together, which is odd because of how close they were during this film. Mystique was played by Jennifer Lawrence in this film, and in 2011, Jennifer Lawrence was really just starting to become famous. This was a year before The Hunger Games, before she won an Oscar for Silver Linings Playbook, so while Mystique has a big role, it's nowhere near as big as it would be going forward. This film delivered everything that it needed to and more. This was such a huge task of a film with all the recastings, as well as making people excited about the X-Men again after two entries that weren't so well received. It was also the first movie that mostly didn't feature Wolverine, and that was also quite a big statement. A lot of people call this their favorite X-Men film, and I don't really blame you if you do. In some ways, this is the most X-Men out of all the X-Men movies, if that makes any sense. For me, I'd still prefer X2, but this film easily comes in second place so far, so 8.5 out of 10. So after basically rebooting the franchise with First Class, you can't lose out on your star of the franchise, Hugh Jackman, so you make another movie centering on him, because that worked out so well the last time. Well, the good news is that this movie is certainly better. It's definitely more of a character study on Wolverine, how he's living with the trauma of killing Jean Grey, and more of his past history is explained. I had only ever watched this movie once. I watched it again for this video because I didn't really think it was all too special the first time around, and it turns out I was more or less right this time when I watched it again. We start off with a flashback to Logan in Japan when he saves someone from the atomic bomb. In the present, this guy guy contacts Logan because he wants his healing powers. Logan says no, goes through some cool fight scenes, falls in love again, gets his claws taken from him, and that's kind of the movie. The most interesting part of this film is the ending scene. We see Logan reunite with Magneto, who has his powers again, and he's also with Charles Xavier, who's alive and well. They talk about a new threat rising that could mean the end for all mutants, and we see a commercial for Trask Industries on the TV. This film is kinda hit or miss. If you like the whole samurai vibe, then you'll probably like this movie a lot. This does go back and touch on some of Logan's comic origins as well, but this movie is largely confusing for me because it just doesn't seem that necessary. Sure, Wolverine is a great character and it's always cool to see him in action scenes, but this movie isn't essential to understand the character or really anything else going forward. Like I said, it's pretty hit or miss. With me, it's more of a miss, unfortunately, but I also don't think it's a bad movie by any means. Not really my cup of tea, don't really see the point in it, so 6 out of 10. Now, if I was saying X-Men First Class had a lot to live up to, then Days of Future Past dialed that to 11, because this movie was by far the most ambitious film of the franchise, and to this day, there really isn't any other superhero movie like this one. This movie was a sequel to 2 different franchises, the one that ended on a not so high note, and a movie that basically wrapped up all loose ends with First Class. How on earth do you make a sequel to 2 films at once? Well, you bring back the original cast, tell a story where the stakes are higher than ever before, deliver a huge, shocking turn of events that quite literally changes the franchise, mix that all together, and you have, prepare yourself here, what I think to be the greatest superhero movie ever made. Shocking statement, I know, and no, it's not as good as things like The Dark Knight, but in terms of the greatest of the great MCU movies, anything else out there, I think that Days of Future Past stands as my personal favorite superhero movie. Yeah, I said it. Do I have an extreme bias towards X-Men? Yes, I do. Does that influence my decision on calling this the best superhero movie of all time? Of course it does, but I've said it and I stand by it, so let me tell you why. Days of Future Past shows us a world years after X-Men The Last Stand. It's dark, post-apocalyptic, and shows that even the X-Men at full strength and working together as a team still can't beat the Sentinels. There seems to be no hope, and then the opening credits hit us with that same intro music as X-Men 2, and you know you're in for a good time. This opening fight against the Sentinels shows us some returning characters and new ones, all using their powers in unique ways, and how the Sentinels just turn around and use them right back against some of the other X-Men. One of these unique powers is how Kitty Pryde can now send somebody back in time. This sets up a plan to send Wolverine back in time and stop the Sentinels from ever being made in the first place. In order to do this, they have to stop Mystique from killing Tyrion Lannister. Bolivar Trask. What I find very funny is how this future is a continuation of the last trilogy, but there's very little mention of The Last Stand throughout the entire movie. Sure, there's Bobby and Kitty who are now together, even though he ended the trilogy with Rogue, but there's very little mention of Jean or Cyclops, why Professor X is now alive, or how Magneto has his powers. Hell, even how Wolverine has his metal claws back isn't mentioned. You can infer a lot of these things and kind of connect the dots yourself for sure, or you can just look past it because it's all necessary for this story to actually work. But right when Logan is sent back in time, the mood of the film completely changes. The contrast of the 70s to the future is immense and makes for some comedic moments throughout the entire runtime.
You're on acid. Somebody gave you really bad acid. Yeah.
Logan talking to the younger Charles and Hank and telling them about the future sounds insane, and with a broken and disheveled Charles, it makes you realize just how much Wolverine has changed across all of his films, that now he has to be the mentor to Charles, when it was the other way around all those years ago. In a lot of ways, this film is a return to form to the X2 days. Some of the strengths that movie had, this movie has too, like introducing new characters. So let's talk about Quicksilver. One of the more memorable moments from this film and about this new trilogy in general is the character of Quicksilver. Now, something I do remember about the time this film was being made was that Quicksilver was going to be in this film, but also in Avengers Age of Ultron. Something about the rights of the character being shared. Who cares? But I remember everybody was saying that they have no clue why this movie was going to use Quicksilver when the MCU was just so obviously going to make the character better. Well, everybody ate their words, because even if you don't agree this is the best comic book movie ever made like I do, I think everybody can agree that Quicksilver was done incredibly well in this film, far better than the MCU version. Both MCU versions. The scenes with the younger Charles and Eric proved to be just as compelling as the scenes with the older Charles and Eric, which just proves how well cast these characters were. With all four of them in the same film, they could have easily been overshadowed by the legacy actors, but they aren't, and this is one of the aspects that really works in this film. Seeing the younger versions bicker and fight over what is essentially their friendship at this point, while the older versions are working together for a bigger cause, makes you see just how far these two characters have come and will go, and how their whole story of being frenemies is far more tragic than anything else. A lot of the bigger moments of tension are well earned and well executed. When the moment finally comes to stop Mystique from killing Trask, they succeed, only for Magneto to try and take matters into his own hands by killing her, which would stop the future from happening, but only on his terms. Logan can't stop him because who's there to shake him to his core but William Stryker. These moments, while obviously convenient, all flow together to make a cohesive story. Perhaps the best scene in this film is when the younger Charles looks into Logan's mind and sees the future, having a conversation with his older self. Having a scene with both versions of this character almost borders on like fan service, but it also absolutely works for this story. The younger Charles needed to have this conversation in order to fully believe in himself and carry out the task at hand. This movie is filled with moments like this too. I mentioned back in the first class portion that Mystique would continue to have a bigger role going forward, and that's on full display in this film. This entire story hinges on the choice of Mystique. In the end, when Mystique has the choice to kill Trask or leave him be is really the scene that makes the movie for me. Essentially, she can pull the trigger and the rest of the movies will play out exactly as they have, and this series will essentially be complete, or she can not pull the trigger and the entire history of events will change. I remember watching this scene for the first time in the theaters, fully realizing these ramifications and really wondering what they were gonna do here. In some ways, it makes more sense for her to just pull the trigger so that way the rest of the movies can carry on the way that they did, but if she didn't pull the trigger, then this whole universe changes. Ultimately, she doesn't pull the trigger, and the entire X-Men universe as we know it is changed. Hinging this storyline on Mystique is obviously due to the fact that she's being played by Jennifer Lawrence. She was at an all-time high in fame and popularity at this point, but the plot doesn't feel forced or just giving her more screen time than she deserves. They crafted the story around her importance, and that's what makes it work. Wolverine has obviously been the selling point for this franchise, so sending him back in time because he has a healing factor that would allow him to survive the trip also makes sense since they built the story around him being sent there. I also like that it's not Wolverine who saves the day at the end. All seems lost in the future timeline, especially when Wolverine gets dumped into the lake by Magneto, and then it's really up to Charles and Mystique. There's such a hopeless feeling towards the end, and it's what makes the twist that changes everything that much better. In the end, it seems that everything is fixed, and the events of the first trilogy never actually happened anymore. There are two different versions of this movie. There's the theatrical version and the Rogue cut. The Rogue cut adds a few scenes, but ultimately isn't that different from the theatrical version. The main changes are essentially that Rogue has to take over for Kitty after she gets injured, giving her something to do as an X-Man, which was one of my main issues with The Last Stand, so I like that there's some redemption there for her character. There's also an extra scene with the older Magneto infiltrating the mansion with Bobby in order to get Rogue, and this is a scene that I actually really like despite there not really being any setup for it. It gives some extra time with the future versions of the characters, and this movie is already split like 70-30 in favor of the past timeline, so whenever I watch a version of this movie, it's usually the Rogue cut. While yes, I do refer to this as my favorite comic book movie, there are some issues with it. In a series that usually has a really fantastic villain, Bolivar Trask seems pretty underutilized. I think there's some hints of a great character in there, but with how much this movie already had to do, I think Bolivar Trask was clearly not very high up on the priority list. There are definitely some plot holes, and that just comes in the territory when telling a story like this, but why doesn't the future change when the mutants are first revealed in the past? Wouldn't that change like a ton of events in the timeline? Or when the Sentinels attack, wouldn't they not trust Trask anymore to carry out this program? Is it because Wolverine hadn't come back to the future yet? The way all of this works isn't very clear. There is a line Hank has about the ripple effect, but if they were to try and make it make more sense, the movie would be much, much longer. The ending scene also doesn't make any sense at all. We see Stryker getting Wolverine, which would lead into the experiments, but it's not actually Stryker, it's Mystique. This doesn't actually end up leading anywhere, so it's odd that they added in this eye effect, when if they didn't, the story would have actually made more sense. But overall, the nuance and deeper moments are back. This isn't just an action set piece movie, it has a lot to say, not only about social issues, but about friendship and the ability to change. X-Men has always dealt with social issues, and this one does it too, but it also takes it a step further. It also even has a subtle nod towards addiction and the war on drugs. I can look past a few of the issues this movie has because of how much it had to overcome. Being a sequel for 2 different movies at the same time and decide whether or not to change the entire franchise or make it come full circle. As you can probably expect with how much time I've spent talking about this movie, I did say it was my favorite comic book movie. After all, I'm giving Days of Future Past a 10 out of 10. So I'm not really going to spend too long on these because as fun as they really are just kind of a footnote in this universe, at least for now. That might change depending on how Deadpool 3 goes, but as for now, these are funny, fourth wall breaking films about a small pocket in the X-Men universe. You know that this is part of the newer timeline because of the X-Men cameo in Deadpool 2 when Beast shuts the door, but also because of the character of Colossus. In the original trilogy of X-Men and Days of Future Past, this was Colossus, but in Deadpool, he has a pretty semi-accurate comic look and has more qualities from the comics. So due to some kind of butterfly or domino effect, Colossus looks like this now and not this. I think both of these movies are pretty on par with each other. They're both pretty small scale compared to the rest of the X-Men stories. Even the second one with Cable is still a smaller story than, say, this next movie. I'd give both of these movies like a 7.5, and you know, sometimes smaller scale is better because the bigger the scale, the harder the movie is typically to make, and we find that out in full swing here. So this one is probably the weirdest movie for me out of all of them. Coming off the hot streak with Days of Future Past and First Class, you'd think that if they kept the same teams behind it, that the third movie would also be good, right? I don't really understand where this movie went wrong. It's not awful, but it's not as good as First Class or Days of Future Past. This movie is, in some ways, smaller in scale than the previous film, but in other ways it's much more massive. Apocalypse is to the X-Men what Thanos is to the Avengers, so the task was certainly very daunting. On top of trying to do this villain justice, they also needed to do the characters right, and it was this job's movie to introduce the younger versions of characters we've seen before, more specifically Scott and Jean. This turns into an issue very quickly because the movie tries to do a lot all at the same time. And at the same time, there's some opportunity to deliver justice to these characters and the X-Men in general. There is a brand new timeline, so characters like Nightcrawler and Angel make a return, but they aren't confined to the same backstories they had in the previous trilogy. A lot of this new timeline has to do with Mystique because she's the reason for all these changes, and this comes with its fair share of ups and downs, but I'll get to that in a little bit. A big problem with this movie is that the script is not very good. Remember when I said that the nuance and deeper moments were back? Well, they're gone again.
Don't try to stop me from killing these men.
So much happens in this movie, and I think that the script kind of forced these characters to say things that they probably wouldn't say if they weren't trying to move the plot along so fast, so it just comes off as a little strange. I feel like this is 2 movies being squashed into one. There's the rise of the X-Men team that most of us know and love, and then there's the rise of their greatest enemy. I feel like Apocalypse is just the wrong villain for this movie. I think this movie should have focused on the rise of the X-Men and have them face off against Magneto. A lot of them are learning about Magneto and what he's done, and also the history that he and Charles have, while also building up their own chemistry and relationship dynamics. Maybe in the next movie, when the team is fully formed, you could introduce Apocalypse, but all of this in one movie feels very forced. Cyclops and Jean aren't anything other than supporting characters, so they don't have the proper time to develop their relationship, and while they're better than they were in the first trilogy, it's not by much. I'm still waiting for the day that they do these characters justice, because it wasn't in the first three, it's not in this one, and it's definitely not in the next one either. Now, I say that Magneto should have been the villain, but I have to mention that as this movie stands, Magneto is fantastic. In the beginning, we see that Magneto is a changed man with a family that he genuinely loves very much. But after he accidentally outs himself, his family gets killed and he goes back on the Magneto rampage. Michael Fassbender is fantastic in this role once again, and so is James McAvoy, but not as much in this one. Part of this, well, actually all of this, is due to Charles' script in the movie. He's kind of reduced to a moron when he's not teaching his students, whereas Magneto's script feels mostly fully realized. He also has a far more emotional part than Charles does, letting him flex his acting muscles a little bit more and show us how great of an actor he really is. There's also this moment when they try and poke fun at the original X-Men trilogy, saying that the third one is always the worst one, which is funny because out of this new trilogy, this one is also clearly the worst one, so kind of shooting yourself in the foot there. So let's talk about Mystique, or more so Jennifer Lawrence. You could tell that she was now an A-list actor and didn't want to sit in the makeup chair for hours on end, so Mystique is only really in her real form for like 5 minutes of the entire movie. They try to give a reason for this, saying that she isn't really Mystique anymore and that she doesn't want to be a hero, but this doesn't really make a ton of sense. It's a very half-baked story like most of the plots in this film, and in this one Mystique definitely gets more screen time than she needs. She's basically just Katniss Everdeen again because they knew audiences liked her in that kind of role, but it doesn't really work for Mystique. One of the things that worked in the last film was Quicksilver, so they gave him an increased role and another iconic scene where he saves everybody from certain death. This is a really fun scene, it really is, maybe the best one in the whole movie, and it shows that Quicksilver is actually really overpowered. Nightcrawler is one of the bright spots of this film. It really does feel like the same character as Alan Cummings' Nightcrawler in X-Men 2, and for that I give Cody Smith-McPhee props. They feel like the same character, unlike someone, like Storm, who seems like a completely different character and is a villain in this one for some reason. And of course, it wouldn't be an X-Men movie without your signature Wolverine scene. So let's show his origin again and have him share a weird moment with teenage Jean Grey, because that's not weird or anything. That's so weird. The director of these films really likes to insinuate Sheila Rolls with minors. I wonder if there's a reason for that. The third act of this film is really weird. Charles goes into Apocalypse's mind to have a fist fight with him, which is so unlike the character of Charles Xavier. Jean is the one who saves the day because she's turning into the Phoenix, rushing to yet another plotline that doesn't need to be rushed. But Magneto switches sides to the X-Men again, completing his character arc of the film and proving that Magneto is the best part of the movie. It is cool to see the X-Men use all their powers against a common enemy, but it's the same feeling I had watching the Justice League working together. It's cool because it reminds me of the cartoons, but something is definitely missing. Also, it seems like the CGI budget just kind of ran out towards the end of this movie because some of the shots towards the end are just completely unfinished. Overall, this movie seems like one that was afraid to take a risk. Everyone really likes Charles and Eric in central roles, so let's not take those away from them. Everybody really liked the Quicksilver scene in the last one, so let's make an even bigger scene and give him a bigger role. Everyone really likes the giant CGI battles at the end of Marvel movies, let's add in one of those. This feels more like the average Marvel movie than what made the X-Men movies so special and different. And at the end of the day, there's absolutely no stakes in this movie. This movie takes place in the same timeline as the end of Days of Future Past, the one where everybody is alive and well. So how could Apocalypse really do any harm to the X-Men when they're all actually alive? Is this a good movie? Yeah, it's a fine movie. Is this on par with the quality of the better X-Men movies? Absolutely not. This is very clearly a movie that was influenced by Marvel, and for that reason, it doesn't feel like an X-Men movie. It's a fun watch, not as bad as some others, and has a few good redeeming factors to it, so 7 out of 10. So at the end of this movie, they're now a fully formed team. They have some semi-comic accurate costumes. Now we're going to see a movie about the X-Men working as a team against a common enemy. This is going to be great. Oh, you've got to be kidding me. So the first time around, this storyline didn't get its justice due to an over-bloated movie loaded with production issues, so a movie actually dedicated to the storyline will surely be much better, right? So I'm gonna come out clean here. This is actually the only one that I hadn't seen before making this video. I was actually excited to see it in theaters. The trailers seemed promising, and I thought maybe this time they'll do the story justice, but when the reviews came out and talked about how bad this movie was, I figured it was just best to not see it. But for this video, I wanted to watch and rewatch all of these films, so I was just hoping that maybe this movie aged a bit more gracefully. Let's start out with the things that I liked about this movie. The soundtrack is really great. It's unique among other X-Men films, it's unique among other superhero films, and it's unique among Hans Zimmer's other scores. The tone of this film is much darker, and for the most part, I think it works. I feel like this is what a movie featuring Apocalypse should have had to it, but whatever, we're past that now. This movie is solely focused on telling the Phoenix story. There's no cure this time around, so at least they're putting all their eggs into one basket. The X-Men actually feel like X-Men, at least in the beginning of the movie. We're over the time of the government being wary of mutants. Now they're counted upon for when things go wrong, and they feel like an actual team. So basically everything seemed to be going smoothly. The first 20 minutes or so, actually to be precise, the first 19 minutes and 40 seconds of the movie were really great. Then we got what must be the greatest line in cinematic history.
And by the way, the women are always saving the men around here. You might want to think about changing the name to X-Women.
Immediate Oscar for best screenplay here. I mean, this line should just be played on repeat in film museums. No, not even film museums, just any museum in general. After this singular line, the movie seems to take a steep and direct downfall. This line doesn't even make any sense. For one, this is coming right after the scene where Nightcrawler was the one who saved everybody, and more importantly, X-Men is not a term about men. It has men in the title, sure, but so does mankind, and that refers to everybody. X-Men are a group, or people, a team. It has nothing to do with gender, and this line just starts a debate that doesn't even need to be started. I'm sure I'll still get comments hating what I'm saying here, and it's all due to this line not making any sense. So other than this line, let's talk about the other bad things. This one is a bit more to do with the entire new timeline, but nobody ages at all. Wolverine doesn't age because that's part of his power. But why don't Charles, Eric, Hank, or Mystique age? We've seen them in movies across 4 different decades now, and they all look exactly the same. It doesn't really seem like anybody wanted to be part of this movie. James McAvoy and Michael Fassbender never turn in a bad performance. Sophie Turner and some of the younger cast do great, but Jennifer Lawrence was very clearly over this franchise, being killed off pretty early on, wearing like an ounce of makeup that was required for her to actually look like Mystique. Evan Peters doesn't do very much since he's injured for the majority of the film. The franchise was over and everybody knew it, so it seemed like everybody was already 1 foot into the grave delivering their lines.
You only want the girl. Step aside.
No!
These films just love finding reasons to make Magneto the villain, and it is supremely obvious in this one. He wants to kill Jean because of what she did to Mystique, but it's been so long since he ever cared for her. He had a whole wife and kid after his relationship with Mystique, so it just kind of feels forced for Magneto to be a villain again. But I can also see why they wanted to do this, because the actual villains are not very good. They have absolutely no personality, and they're literally just aliens that want to take over the world. So maybe it's because I've been hearing such awful things about this movie for years, even things from the cast and the production crew themselves, but I actually didn't find this movie to be terrible. Is it on par with the better X-Men films? Absolutely not. Is it near the bottom of the franchise? Yeah, probably, but I also don't think it's the very bottom either. This movie is riddled with problems. It's not a very good send-off for these characters, but it's not as bad as I imagined it would be. I was going in with astronomically low expectations, so there's that, but I didn't find it to be an awful movie. Again, there's an X-Men bias here, and maybe I was just glad to revisit these characters again. I'll give it like a 5 out of 10, nothing too special, but nothing horrific either. For the most part.
X-Women.
For an ending to a franchise, this is kind of a bummer of a movie. It's not a very happy ending, and as this is the final film of the proper X-Men universe, it kind of encapsulates the entire universe. There are some bright spots here and there, there's good performances, tons of production issues, and some really, really bad spots too. The ending also doesn't make a ton of sense. There's no real resolution, and if this is supposedly the same timeline as Days of Future Past, then when does all this happen? The ending just kind of leaves a bad taste in your mouth regarding the whole movie, which is a shame because I think there's a skeleton of a movie that could have been really great. It seems that no matter how great the movies that come before it or after it, whenever they try to adapt the Dark Phoenix storyline, they put the wrong people in charge, they have the wrong team around them, and they just absolutely cannot do this storyline justice. Well, when it inevitably gets made in the MCU, maybe the third time will finally be the charm. This is a movie that they gave absolutely zero shits about. Fox had already been bought by Disney, it was delayed like 6 times, they had so many reshoots, and then it turned out to be absolutely nothing like the trailer for the movie. This movie is not very good, it didn't really affect anything at all, and I mean even less than Deadpool in that regard, and if the handling of Dark Phoenix was rough because of the Disney-Fox merger, then this one got the even shorter end of that stick. I didn't even rewatch it for this video, probably will never watch it again. 4 out of 10. So here we are on another cold streak, and I know this wasn't the order of release, but I figured I'd try to not pull a Dark Phoenix and actually end this series of reviews on a high note. There's not a whole lot I can say about Logan that hasn't been said or thought already. This movie is a perfect and beautiful send-off to one of the greatest comic book characters ever put to screen. Not only is it a perfect send-off for Logan, but it's also a perfect send-off for Charles. The 3 leads in this film are all incredible. You have Hugh Jackman, who gives his best performance as the character, Patrick Stewart playing a senile Professor X and having the most fun with it you could possibly imagine, and the newcomer Daphne Keane, who doesn't have a whole lot of lines but is very clearly on the tracks to have a fantastic career. Watching all of these films back to back and ending with Logan makes this movie seem so out of place and jarring in the best ways. It's so disconnected and in a lot of ways disturbing in comparison to all the other films. Dark Phoenix has a darker tone to it, but it's nothing compared to Logan. This movie was rated R, and they had as much fun with this R rating as you can possibly imagine. The action is brutal and grounded, showing us what would actually happen to people if Wolverine killed them with his claws, and this is set up from the very opening scene. The fight scenes aren't bombastic or large scale like a lot of the set pieces in the previous movies, and yet it works so much better here than anywhere else in the series. And it's not because this movie is trying to be overly realistic. There are scenes where Logan and Laura are fighting side by side, and it's badass because it's trying to be badass. I like that they let the action scenes just be action scenes without any higher mention of how Laura shouldn't kill people, she's so young. No, she's a killing machine and people want to see her take out the bad guys because it's fun to watch. I like that in this movie the X-Men have comics based on their adventures. It actually makes it seem like a continuation of the Dark Phoenix storyline where there were toys of the X-Men and everybody looked at them as superheroes. But what this movie does truly great is reduce the X-Men to their simplest terms: helping people. It might have been seen as a move to sell tickets, but Patrick Stewart is in this film for a very specific reason. Logan doesn't really care about anybody but himself and Charles, but Charles convinces him to keep the next generation alive, and it proves that even a senile Professor X is still all about helping younger people. When Charles dies, Logan makes it his mission to help all these younger kids get across the border, even if he doesn't make it with them. I remember when the talks came out about a Last of Us movie a few years ago, before the show was out, and I said that we already have a Last of Us movie with Logan. If you think about it, they are basically the same story with a different font. Even a lot of the fan casts were Hugh Jackman and Daphne Keane as Joel and Ellie, but they already made the exact same story, just with superheroes and not zombies. This movie is dark in all the best ways, the action is brutal and choreographed extremely well, there's heartfelt messages and performances all around, and overall delivers the true final chapter of the Fox X-Men franchise. Is this a better movie overall than Days of Future Past? Yeah, probably. I still prefer it to Logan, but but I'd be an idiot if I didn't also score this a 10 out of 10. One of the things I hardly ever hear people mention is how doomed the Fox X-Men universe was. Not in terms of the production side of things, but the actual in-universe doom. There's a lot of different ways people interpret Logan when it comes to timelines, but wherever you put it makes it just as tragic as the next spot. The official answer from the director is that this takes place in the new timeline that was created from Days of Future Past, and that's this timeline. If that's true, then that means Logan has already went back in time to stop the Sentinels from being created just for mutants to still be hunted and wiped out. Now, there's not really any mention of any of these events or who this Logan specifically is. The only mention of previous X-Men films is Liberty Island from the first X-Men film. So if this takes place in another universe where Jean doesn't die and the X-Men all stay together, then the world is still doomed. No matter where you place this movie, in which timeline, no matter how many changes are made to all these different timelines, the universe is ultimately doomed for the mutants, and that's incredibly depressing to think about. Hank says something in Days of Future Past about the ripple effect, how you can throw a stone into the water to create some ripples, but the water always rights itself. Maybe going back in time and stopping the Sentinels was the ripple, but the water that rights itself is that mutants are hunted down and destroyed. I know I said I wanted to go out on a bright note. Sorry, I gave this movie a 10, alright? That's still pretty cheery. So here it is, the timeline. Now, as I've stated in the video, there's a lot of different ways people look at this timeline. You can go and search the official timeline. You'll find different articles with different answers, but this is the way that I look at it, and frankly, this is the one that makes the most sense. If you're wondering what movie I'm showing on screen at any particular moment, just look up right here and I'll tell you. We start our journey off with Wolverine. Wolverine and his brother go through all kinds of different wars until they're approached by William Stryker to be part of his special team. They join his team where Stryker experiments on Logan, turning his bones into metal known as adamantium, hence his indestructible claws. Logan then turns against Stryker, going after him only to be shot by an adamantium bullet. This causes him to lose his memory about his life, and he becomes a wandering man. Years later, Logan is in Canada. Mutants are discriminated against, and the world is in a general sense of unease. Logan meets a younger mutant named Rogue. He lets her tag along when they're attacked by some other mutants. Other mutants then come to their rescue and bring Logan and Rogue to Xavier's Institute for the Gifted. Charles Xavier runs a school of mutants, teaching them to control their powers and use them for the greater good. Charles' nemesis is an old friend of his named Eric Lencher, or Magneto. Magneto runs the Brotherhood of Mutants. While Charles believes mutants and humans can coexist and work together, Magneto believes that mutants are the advanced species and they should rule the world. Logan joins the X-Men partly due to his interest in Jean Grey, and together they foil Magneto's plans. Even after Magneto is arrested and behind, well, not bars for obvious reasons, the world is still very hesitant of mutants. After an assassination attempt on the President of the United States, the President gives authorization for William Stryker to attack Charles Xavier's mansion and capture the mutants. Things don't go exactly according to plan thanks to Wolverine, but Stryker captures some of the mutants, including Professor X, and even reunites with Wolverine. Wolverine has some kind of recollection of Stryker, but he wants more answers. Because Stryker poses a threat to all mutants, Magneto teams up with the X-Men and they head over to Alkali Lake. They get the professor and the students back. Logan learns a bit more about his history with Stryker, but opts to go back with the rest of the X-Men instead of going with Stryker. But there's a problem with the jet, and they're sitting ducks in a valley that's about ready to be flooded if they don't get out soon. Jean Grey takes it upon herself to go outside of the jet, lift it up while containing the rushing waves of water, and sacrifice herself in order for the others to escape. Both Wolverine and Scott take Jean's death rather hard, but when Scott hears Jean calling to him, he returns to Alkali Lake, finding Jean alive and well. Sorta, because she kills him, her powers now taking complete control of her and her actions. Meanwhile, the United States has figured out how to cure the mutants. Magneto takes this quite personally, because he doesn't believe that they need to be cured. Wolverine and Storm find Jean and bring her back to the mansion, though they see that it's not really Jean after all. Charles and Magneto both try to go and calm her down, both of them with different motivations behind this action, though she takes this personally, killing the professor and joining Magneto. Magneto raises an army of mutants to destroy the cure, so it's up to the X-Men to stop Magneto and his army. They ultimately do, stabbing Magneto with the cure and wiping him of his powers. But now it's Jean that needs to be taken out. Logan is the only one who can physically survive and get close enough to her, so however painful it might be for him, he ultimately has to kill the woman he loves. Magneto loses, though it doesn't seem the cure works as intended, and Charles might have found another way to come back. Logan takes Jean's second death even harder than the first. He leaves the mansion, going to Japan, where an old person that he saved contacts him asking for his powers. Logan refuses, learns to fall in love again, but gets attacked by an adamantium robot, aka the old man he thought was dead. Logan gets his claws cut off, but retains his powers and his life. Heading back to America, Logan encounters Magneto, back with his powers, and an old friend that he thought was long dead, Charles Xavier. They're working together because they believe there is a new threat for all of mutant kind. And they couldn't be more right, because years later the world is basically a post-apocalyptic wasteland. Mutant hunting machines called Sentinels have all but taken over, killing every mutant in their path and humans that stand in their way. The remaining X-Men come up with a plan to stop the Sentinels by sending Wolverine back in time to stop Mystique from ever killing a man named Bolivar Trask, the man who made the Sentinels. So they send Logan's consciousness back in time to a period where Charles and Eric were never further apart. But there was a time where Charles and Eric were friends. They conceived the idea of the X-Men together and even recruited mutants together who would serve as students in the academy. One of these people they tried to recruit is Wolverine, though he tells them very nicely that he's not interested. Though no matter what they did, Charles and Eric would always be at odds when it came to ideals. This comes on full display during the Cuban Missile Crisis, where Magneto takes revenge upon the man who killed his family and accidentally forces a bullet into Charles' spine, forcing him into the wheelchair. Years later, Magneto is imprisoned, Charles' Academy is in disarray, and all hope seems to be lost. That is, until Wolverine's consciousness is sent back to this time from the future. It's his job to reunite Charles and Eric and have them stop Mystique from killing Trask. They successfully stop her, only to out mutant kind to the entire world and force the United States to take even more interest in Trask's Sentinels. Charles and Eric are at odds with one another yet again, and while the Sentinels attack in the future, it comes down to Mystique whether or not she wants to kill Trask and set the world on the course it's heading, or let him live and change the future. She drops the weapon, and the future is changed. The events of the first 3 films never happen, the Academy is thriving, and everybody is alive and well. But in the past, the world is set on a new path. This means that people like Colossus, and more importantly Deadpool, now look entirely different. But because of this change in events, the X-Men are faced with things they never dealt with before, such as the villain Apocalypse. Thought to be a god across many different generations, Apocalypse is accidentally set loose from his eternal slumber, collecting his horsemen of the apocalypse and setting out to rule the world. It's up to the X-Men and the younger versions of these characters like Scott, Jean, and Nightcrawler to stop the apocalypse from happening. They succeed, and now mutants are looked at as the world's superheroes. The X-Men are called upon by the president when they are in need, and all seems well until a blast of energy gets forced into Jean, unlocking her ultimate powers she can't control. She accidentally kills Mystique, forcing the X-Men to be at odds with one another and Magneto wanting her dead. A group of aliens called the Debari infiltrate Earth and look to use Jean's powers for their own purposes. But the X-Men get to her first, and Jean sacrifices herself to stop this alien invasion. But somewhere along the way, Jean must have come back because she's alive and well right here. We just never got a movie explaining all of this. So while the Academy is thriving here and everybody is alive, it's not too much longer when things go awry. Charles is old and doesn't quite know how to control his powers, accidentally decimating the Academy and forcing the government to once again want to hunt down and destroy the mutants. Though as Logan finds out, there's a whole new generation of mutants, one of them technically being his daughter. But Logan is old, he's lived through many different lifetimes, literally, and he gives his own life so that way the next generation can escape, his daughter burying him and marking his grave with a symbolic X. So that's the X-Men timeline. Confused?
I'd be surprised if you weren't.
Like I said, this is how I make sense of this universe. It may not be 100% correct, but nobody really knows what's 100% correct in this universe anyways. I didn't include the New Mutants in the timeline because it's not really an important movie. And there was also a show called Gifted or something that I never watched. I'm not too sure if it actually ties in with this universe or not, but it's apparently an X-Men show. X-Men seems to be more culturally relevant than ever before. Literally just the opening scene of the first film seems like you could replace a few words and it would be an actual real meeting that the government would have. Just about all of these movies do such a great job at telling a story with a strong message behind it without being too in your face.
Or you might want to think about changing the name to X-Women.
Well, like I said, almost all of them. While yes, there are a metric crap ton of inconsistencies and plot holes, a lot of this can basically be boiled down to the differences in timelines. While there have been some very high highs and some very low lows, the Fox X-Men franchise will probably always be remembered for how confusing it was. You have a couple different trilogies and one-offs that make up the universe. You have the original trilogy that has 2 pretty good movies and 1 meh movie. You have the New Timeline trilogy, well, I guess it's a quadrilogy, but let's leave this one out for now, that has 2 really great movies and another meh movie. You have the Wolverine trilogy that has 1 really bad movie, 1 okay movie, and then probably the best movie in the franchise. And then you have the 2 Deadpool movies, whatever New Mutants is, and Dark Phoenix, which feels even more out of place when you put things like this. The franchise was a roller coaster of ratings and timelines, some of which are still confusing and don't have any concrete answers today and maybe never will. There's really not any hope for a clarification going forward because as it stands, this is a dead universe. Well, there is Deadpool 3, and Hugh Jackman is going to return as Wolverine. We've already seen Patrick Stewart's Charles Xavier in the MCU, so perhaps we'll be seeing Ian McKellen, James McAvoy, or any of the other actors in Deadpool 3. I've heard a few rumors, but nothing is really certain until we actually see the film. Perhaps the MCU won't reboot the X-Men and they'll somehow continue this timeline mess of a franchise. Only time will tell. I put all my ratings in at the end of each movie, but this is them in descending order from best to worst. Let me know if you agree down in the comments below or why I'm wrong. If you enjoyed this video, I would greatly appreciate a thumbs up and a subscribe. If you want to see more videos like this, let me know which ones in the comments below and which franchise. If you do all that, then I'll see you in the next one.
Yeah.